The founding of Jamestown in Virginia in 1607 was North America's first English colony, which preceded the Pilgrims that arrived at Plymouth in Massachusetts by 13 years. It all starts with Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World in 1492. Spain led the charge in establishing colonies in the Americas, while the English attempted to do the very same thing at Roanoke Colony in 1587. It resulted in a complete failure. This leads us to 1606, when King James I granted a charter to establish an English colony in North America. The expedition was sponsored by the Virginia Company of London, a group of investors seeking to earn a profit. On December 20th, 1606, around 100 colonists, all were male, left England on 3 ships: the Suzanne Constant, the largest ship, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. Arriving at the Virginia coast in late April of 1607, the voyage was led by Captain Christopher Newport. They explored the inland waterway for around 2 weeks, reaching their selected location, a narrow peninsula in the James River. The site for Jamestown was picked because it met all the standards of the Virginia Company, but it was also a great defensive position against the Spanish, as well as water surrounded 3 sides of the site. The water was also deep, just enough so the English could tie their ships at the shoreline. It is also important to note that the site the colonists picked was not inhabited by the natives. Once on the site, the colonists then read the instructions sent by the Virginia Company. It was a list of council members that was chosen by the officials in England. The name of the council members, up until this point, were held safe inside sealed boxes. Each ship was given a box. The names go as followed. The first president of the Virginia colony was tasked to Edward Maria Winfield. The other 6 council members were Bartholomew Gunsnold, Christopher Newport, John Martin, John Ratcliffe, George Kendall, and finally John Smith. The fort was completed by June 14th. The fort was triangular in shape with a bulwark at each end, housing 4 or 5 parts of artillery. The fort was equipped with a storehouse for weapons and other supplies, a church, and a couple of houses. Jamestown was prepared for the Spanish, but it turns out the English settlers were living on the hunting land of around 14,000 Powhatan Indians, with their leader being Chief Powhatan. On June 22nd, Captain Newport set out to report back to England and gather more supplies and colonists, bringing with him the Suzanne Constant and the Godspeed, with 40 crew members. Not too long after Captain Newport left, the colonists were running low on supplies. They resorted to drinking contaminated water from the river, which was responsible for killing many settlers. They also died from fevers, famine, and even wars with the natives. Luckily, by September of 1608, Captain John Smith became the colony's leader. Smith established stricter rules, such as the no work, no food policy. John Smith was also successful in creating trade with the Powhatan Indians for food. Of course, what led up to peace between the Powhatan Indians and the English colonists was no simple task. Another key player was involved. She is famously known as well, Pocahontas, Chief Powhatan's favorite daughter. But I'll save the history of Pocahontas for another video. If not for the new understandings between both groups, Chief Powhatan might not have been willing to send gifts of food to the English, saving their lives. In the fall of 1609, John Smith was injured by burning gunpowder and returned to England. Not long after John Smith left, the disaster known as Starving Time occurred. During the brutal winter of 1609 to early 1610, the relationship between the Powhatan Indians and English had been ruined, as the English demanded too much food during a drought. The English were afraid of the natives killing them, so they did not leave the fort. With no trade, the colonists resorted to eating anything for nourishment. This meant eating small animals, the leather off their boots and belts, to even going as far as eating other already dead settlers. Now, cannibalism is a serious claim, but there are 5 historical accounts written about Jamestown or by the colonists that mention the act of cannibalism. Some historians didn't believe these historical accounts. They thought it was politically motivated, an attempt to ruin the reputation of the Virginia Company. But with the discovery of the butchered skull and shin bone of a 14-year-old girl given the name Jane, the theory on cannibalism has finally been confirmed. In fact, the discovery was the only artifact that proved cannibalism by Europeans at any European colony during the course of the colonial period of about 1500 to 1800. Only 10% of Jane's skeleton has been found. The bones were discovered down in a 17th century trash deposit in the cellar of a building built in 1608 in James Fort. I'll spare you guys the gruesome details, but based on the studying of the bones, researchers have found that Jane may have been from a high-status family or served as a maid. This is because she was found to have higher nitrogen levels that indicated she ate a lot of protein. Based off the oxygen isotopes in her tooth and the water she drank in infancy, it can help locate where she was born, which researchers concluded that Jane was most likely from the southern coast of England. From the carbon isotopes in her bones, it showed that she was eating, for the most part, a European diet, meaning that Jane had not been in Jamestown for very long before she died. A close grouping of the cut marks on the skull indicate that Jane was already dead and was not murdered, as you would see signs of a struggle. Based on a different account by a couple of colonists, they claim that a man killed his pregnant wife and ate her, and as a result was executed for murder. This further proves that the colonists only resorted to cannibalism in the most extreme circumstances. If we were to construct Jane's arrival to Jamestown, it might go something like this. It is possible that Jane reached Jamestown somewhere around August of 1609 aboard one of the 6 ships carrying around 300 new settlers from England to resupply the failing colony at Jamestown. Of course, it wasn't sweet sailing, as they survived a hurricane during their journey. One of those ships wasn't so lucky. The flagship, the Sea Venture, was separated from the other ships and was seriously damaged, leading to the passengers and crew being shipwrecked on the inhabited island of Bermuda. But I'll elaborate more on the Sea Venture in a sec. When the new settlers made it to the fort, the majority of their food supplies were either spoiled or used up. Many of the new arrivals were already in poor condition, and the original colonists were starving as well. It just so happens that the Sea Venture was carrying the majority of the supplies for the settlers. The Sea Venture's passengers and crew of 150 people were trapped on Bermuda. Some of the important people aboard the ship were Captain Christopher Newport, John Rolfe, and leaders Sir Thomas Gates, the new appointed governor, and Sir George Somers. The crew retrieved as much supplies as they could. They even salvaged the rigging before the ship sank. The crew and the passengers were stranded on Bermuda for 10 months. Both the settlers of Virginia and England thought they were dead. During their time stranded, they built 2 boats, which they called the Patience and the Deliverance, and made their way to Virginia, arriving on May 24, 1610, with a year's worth of supplies. Upon entering James Fort, Sir Thomas Gates was horrified, as only 60 men and women out of 240 survived starving time. It became clear to Gates that he had to abandon the settlement, so he had plans for him, his crew, and the survivors of starving time to sail to Newfoundland and tag along on board an English fishing boat back to England. But before they could set sail, 2 ships arrived, bringing with them 150 new settlers, more supplies, and the English governor Thomas West, Baron Delaware. This was the result of King James I issuing the Second Charter in an effort to save the failing English colony. Sometime later, Delaware became ill and went back to England, making Sir Thomas Gates the next in charge, along with his second-in-command Sir Thomas Dale. Jamestown was expanded into a new town to the east of the original fort. In 1612, John Rolfe, one of the many survivors of Bermuda, played a significant role in bringing profit to Jamestown. He brought with him a new strain of tobacco seeds, which he most likely stole from the Spanish. But regardless, tobacco became the much-needed cash crop the Virginia Company was waiting for, as the whole point of investing in Jamestown was to make a profit. On July 30th, 1619, the next appointed governor, Yeardley, called for the first representative legislative assembly. This was the first step in government leading to the United States of America. Later in the year, the first documented Africans were brought to Virginia to farm tobacco, which was a lot of hard work. In the same year, the Virginia Company enlisted around 90 women and shipped them to Virginia to become wives and start families, even though there were around 100 women already in Jamestown. 1619 was the year that made starting families a priority. Relative peace followed when John Rolfe married Pocahontas in April of 1614. Pocahontas had been captured and converted to Christianity. With Pocahontas' death during a trip to England in 1617, and the death of her father Powhatan in 1618, it tested the limits of the crumbling peace between the English settlers and the Native American population. The natives had enough of the settlers taking their land and bringing European diseases, wiping out the native population. In March of 1622, the Powhatan Indians made a major attack on the English settlement in Virginia. Jamestown avoided the attack because of a Powhatan boy living with the English warned them. Outposts of Jamestown weren't so fortunate, as the attack killed 350 to 400 of the 1,200 settlers. The Powhatan Indians wanted to be left alone, and the attack was to teach the English a lesson, but the attack, not surprisingly, did the exact opposite, as the two groups would fight for 10 more years, until a fragile peace was agreed upon in 1632. On May 24, 1624, King James I disbanded the Virginia Company in an effort to control the state of affairs. He made Virginia into an official crown colony. That basically means the English monarchy could appoint a governor to rule over the colony. This change in control did not alter the English policy towards the Powhatan Indians. Even though both declared peace in 1632, the English continued to advance on Powhatan lands, building up the tension as more and more settlers arrived in Virginia. In April of 1644, the Powhatan chief, now in his 80s, led another great attack on the English, which resulted in the death of another 350 to 400 of the now 8,000 settlers. The attacks were put to a halt when the Powhatan chief was captured in 1646, where he was shot dead in the back by a guard, which was against his orders. The death of the Powhatan chief brought the eventual end to the Powhatan chiefdom. The new chief in line signed the first treaties with the English, which made the Powhatan Indians subjects of the English, where they lost most of their land and were forced to pay an annual tribute to the colonial governor. Moving through the years, in 1676, an event took place known as Bacon's Rebellion. This is one of the strangest chapters in Jamestown's history, and is very complicated, to the point it can be a separate topic on its own. And so I'll sum up the main points of the event. The settlers were fed up with their tobacco being sold only to the English merchants due to navigation acts. They were also highly taxed and were constantly attacked on the distant plantations by the natives on the borders. So Nathaniel Bacon rounded up around 1,000 settlers to solve the native problem. Bacon forced Governor Berkeley to give him an official order to attack the natives causing the problem. But what Bacon and his posse didn't do was distinguish the tribes causing the attacks and the tribes loyal to the English. This action made Governor Berkeley declare Bacon a rebel and resulted in a civil war in the colony. In September, Bacon and his rebels set fire to Jamestown, destroying 16 to 18 houses, which included the church and the State House. In October, the rebellion met its end with the death of Nathaniel Bacon. Ultimately, many of the rebels were captured and 23 were hanged by Governor Berkeley. Bacon's rebellion, in the end, was a power struggle between two powerful people. Their war almost destroyed Jamestown. As a result of Bacon's rebellion, another treaty was signed between the English and the Virginia natives. This time more tribes were a part of the treaty than the one signed in 1646. The treaty set up more reservation lands and strengthened a yearly tribute of food the tribes had to make to the English. In 1698, another fire was set in Jamestown, but this time it was clearly started by a prisoner awaiting execution in the nearby prison. The fire destroyed important buildings such as the prison and the State House, but luckily the majority of the public records were saved. In 1699, the government and capital were moved from Jamestown to Williamsburg. There were still people living on Jamestown Island and owned farmlands, but it stopped being a town. Nowadays, Jamestown is a historical site, still with a private residence on the island. The National Park Service and Preservation Virginia continues to watch over the site to teach visitors about the significant role Jamestown played in being the first permanent English colony in North America. What do you guys think about Jamestown? Let me know in the comments section below. If you guys have anything history related you want me to cover, make sure to put the topic in the comments as well. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe for more history content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.